By early 1994, the al-Qaeda cell in Nairobi, tasked with planning attacks against the United States and their targets in Africa, was operational. Led by bin Laden's trusted lieutenant Khalid al-Fawaz, the cell established front businesses and charities as a cover for its presence in the city, and for bringing personnel, equipment, and money into Africa. Among the charities was Wadi al-Hajj's Help Africa People. In charge of the casing of targets was the double agent Ali Muhammad, one of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri's and Egyptian Islamic Jihad's most daring and successful operatives. Fluent in several languages, charismatic and fit, Muhammad had a 17-year career in the Egyptian military. Officers from his unit in the Egyptian army had killed President Anwar Sadat. Like Muhammad, they were Egyptian Islamic Jihad members. At the time of the assassination, Ali Muhammad was attending a program in the United States. After leaving the Egyptian army, Muhammad had worked as a security advisor to both Egypt Air and the CIA. He had moved to the United States, married an American woman, Linda Sanchez, whom he met on his first flight over, and acquired U.S. citizenship. In 1986, he joined the U.S. Army and was sent to Fort Bragg, where he lectured on Islamic culture and politics. He took a leave from the Army to train brothers in Afghanistan, a hiatus for which the Army granted approval. And he also regularly took leave to help the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and al-Qaeda on missions ranging from training bin Laden's bodyguards to helping plan operations. The guides and maps that he had initially taken and photocopied from the U.S. Army proved so useful in training al-Qaeda and Egyptian Islamic Jihad members that Muhammad eventually refashioned much of the material into his own pamphlet. He was known in al-Qaeda circles under the alias Abu Muhammad al-Amriki, the American, a tribute to his successfully duping the CIA and the U.S. military. In May 1993, Muhammad attempted to join the FBI as a translator, admitting to the agent in San Jose who interviewed him that he had connections to a terrorist group in Sudan. The name al-Qaeda meant little to the agent, but he referred the matter to the Department of Defense. Years later, when the Bureau requested a transcript of the Department of Defense's subsequent conversation with Muhammad, the Department of Defense said that it had been lost. Among the operatives working with Muhammad in 1994 in Nairobi was Anas al-Libi. Born in Tripoli and identifiable by a scar on the left side of his face, Libby joined al-Qaeda in Afghanistan after standout performances at various training camps. Apart from his considerable computer skills, he rose to become one of the terrorist group's most efficient operatives and often trained other members. With Muhammad and Libby in Nairobi, but for a different purpose, was Hussein Kerchatu, a Moroccan who was one of al-Qaeda's earliest recruits. Kerchatu was training in a flight school in Nairobi to become bin Laden's personal pilot. Three men knew each other well, as both Kerchatu and Libby had been among a group of select new al-Qaeda trainees to whom Muhammad had taught surveillance in Afghanistan just a few years earlier. Libby, in turn, had trained the group in the use of computers for operational purposes. Posing as tourists, in December of 1993, Muhammad and his team conducted surveillance of different sites in Nairobi, including the U.S. Embassy and the United States Agency for International Development, otherwise known as USAID. The men also surveyed possible British, French, and Israeli targets. Khalid al-Fawaz paid for the team's expenses and equipment as they took pictures, monitored traffic and crowds, and learned where security cameras and guards were positioned. Kerchtu's apartment in Nairobi often served as a makeshift darkroom, and when the team completed their surveillance, they wrote up a report which included their recommendations for where to strike. In their view, the best option was to attack the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi. They traveled to al-Qaeda headquarters in Khartoum and briefed bin Laden on their findings. He agreed with their assessment, and after studying the map they had drawn of the U.S. Embassy, he pointed to a spot along the perimeter of the building and told everyone gathered, "Here's where a truck can be driven in for a suicide attack." Al-Qaeda was organized so that different cells were responsible for different parts of an operation. Often, one cell would set up cover businesses in a country, another would conduct surveillance of targets, a third would carry out the attack, and a fourth would clean up afterwards. This separation helped ensure that if one cell was compromised, other operatives would be safe. Having succeeded in their part of the operation, Ali Muhammad and his cell were dismissed, and the cell that would carry out the operations traveled to Nairobi. A separate cell traveled to Dar es Salaam, where a similar attack on the U.S. Embassy there would be being planned. Al-Qaeda had decided to launch simultaneous attacks in order to garner as much attention as possible. Bin Laden calculated that while one attack could be downplayed, the ability of a terrorist organization to inflict simultaneous attacks showed not only the strength of the group, but also American weaknesses, both of which would help with future al-Qaeda recruitment and with the organization's aim of inflicting harm on the United States. The chief of the twin operations was the Egyptian operative known both as Abu Muhammad al-Masri and as Salah, though he also used a fraudulent Yemeni passport under the name Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah. The explosives expert was another Egyptian operative, Abu Abdul Rahman al-Mujahir, also known as Mushin Musa Matawaka Atwa, who would also later become al-Qaeda's chief bomb maker. The suicide bombers were handpicked by bin Laden, two Saudis, Muhammad al-Ohali and Jihad Ali for Nairobi, and an Egyptian, Hamdan Khalif Alal, known as Ahmed the German because of his blonde hair, for Dar es Salaam. Ohali was known in al-Qaeda as Moath al-Baluchi. Jihad Ali's birth name was Jihad Muhammad al-Harazi, and for his al-Qaeda alias was known as Abu Obaida al-Makdi. During the Nairobi operation, he also went by the single name Azam. The three men were informed of their mission, which they eagerly accepted, and they filmed martyrdom videos. The leadership decided that the attacks would occur on Friday, August 7, 1998, at 10:30 a.m., the time of day when Muslims are meant to be in the mosque at prayer. Therefore, al-Qaeda's theologians argued anyone killed in the bombing could not be a real Muslim, as he wasn't at prayer, and so his death would be an acceptable consequence. In Afghanistan, a few days before the bombing, Saif al-Adil, by now al-Qaeda's security chief, approached Salim Hamdan, who had acquired the alias Sakir al-Jadawi, had also been elevated to the position of personal driver for bin Laden. Saif al-Adil said, pointing to one of the guards, "Sakir, I need you to fix that car from the Sheikh's convoy." Hamdan replied, "I'm sure it's fine." Saif al-Adil would reply, "Make sure it's tuned up. We'll probably be on the move soon." The vehicles bin Laden used had tinted windows, and the bodyguards who rode with him carried Kalashnikov machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. Hamdan himself always carried a Russian-manufactured Makarov handgun, although in the event of attack, his main role was to drive bin Laden to safety. They regularly rotated the cars. This was Hamdan's responsibility, so that the convoy would not be easily identifiable. And they chose not to use land cruisers with mounted weapons, as the Taliban leaders did, since those vehicles attracted way too much attention. Bin Laden usually sat in the rear and listened to tape recordings of the Quran, religious lectures, or lectures on other Islamic topics. Other times, he just closed his eyes and relaxed. His response was only disturbed if Zawahiri, Abu Hafs, Saif al-Adil, or another senior al-Qaeda leader was riding with him, in which case a range of topics might need to be discussed, even operations. On the evening before the bombing, Abu Hafs called a meeting at the mosque in bin Laden's Kandahar compound. He read a list of names of people who would have to leave the compound immediately and head to Kabul, and said that they would be transported by plane. In the meantime, bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, Saif al-Adl, and Sheikh Saeed al-Masri, an al-Qaeda Shura council member who replaced Madini al-Taib on the financial committee, would go to another facility in Kandahar. Bin Laden wanted to travel with as small an entourage as possible to avoid being noticed, so he didn't take his average present security detail with him. Abu Jandal later remarked to me, "It was strange to see those guys leaving the compound driving their own trucks and with their families in the back." Later, Saif al-Adl returned and told Abu Jandal to dig trenches around the compound, especially next to the guard posts, as the Americans are going to bomb us soon. Abu Jandal knew the suicide bombers well. He had once chastised al-Ohali for playing with a grenade in the safety pen out. Al-Hali and Abdul Aziz al-Janubi, an alias for Ahmed Mohammed Haza al-Darbi, the brother-in-law of 9/11 hijacker Khalid al-Midar, had been fooling with the grenade, took out the pin, and didn't know how to put it back in. Abu Jandal put the pin back in and made the two of them crawl around the base they were training at as punishment. Al-Ohali had also been stationed as a bodyguard outside the press conference bin Laden gave following his May 1998 meeting with ABC journalist John Miller. The press conference was conducted in the Jihad Wild training camp in Khost, Afghanistan. Also present were Saif al-Adl, al-Zawahiri, and Abu Atata al-Tunisi, head of the military training before he was killed fighting with the Taliban against the Northern Alliance. Abu Atta al-Tunisi was the son-in-law of Abu Dala Tarabak, who oversaw the team of bodyguards charged with protecting bin Laden. Jihad Ali served as a bin Laden bodyguard and was the cousin of Abdul Rahman Hussein Muhammad Abda al-Nashiri. Both were members of the Northern Group. Nashiri's al-Qaeda alias was Mullah Bilal, and Jihad Ali, known for his jokes, nicknamed him Bulbul, Arabic for a kind of bird. When Jihad Ali was selected as the bomber, Nashiri and Khalad prepared him, and Nashiri phoned Jihad Ali's mother, his aunt, to tell her that her son had been martyred. The designated suicide bombing for Tanzania, Ahmed the German, was an explosives trainer whom other operatives had accused of killing little boys. This greatly upset him, and he complained to Abu Jandal, who assured him that the accusations must be false. The Nairobi bombing occurred at 10:35 a.m. A Toyota Dyna truck carrying the bomb exploded near the rear of the U.S. Embassy, killing 12 Americans and 201 others. It was morning rush hour, and cars, buses, and other vehicles were lined up in traffic outside the embassy, including a bus carrying school children. A multi-story sectarian college was demolished, and the U.S. Embassy and a cooperative bank were severely damaged. 4 minutes later, at 10:39, a white Suzuki Samurai truck blew up next to the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, killing 11 people. Hundreds were injured in the two attacks. When the news of the bombing reached him in Afghanistan, Abu Jandal Hamdan and the rest of bin Laden's entourage went to Kabul to be with him. They all kept a low profile. As Hamdan later would say, this was the first time that bin Laden was essentially going to face with the Americans, and he was unsure of what the response would be. It was around 5:30 a.m. on August 7th when my beeper went off, snapping me out of sleep. I rolled over, grabbed the pager from my bedside table, and took a look at the message. It was from my supervisor, Tom Donnelly, telling me to contact him at the office. I jumped out of bed, picked up my house phone, and dialed the office. I heard Tom's voice come on the line. "Tommy, it's Ali. I got your page. What's going on?" "The American embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were bombed this morning. It looked like suicide bombers drove trucks into the embassies and blew themselves up. There's a lot of casualties. Details are still coming in." Tom spoke rapidly, barely pausing between sentences. I silently gathered my thoughts. "Do we know who is responsible?" Tom replied, "It's unclear. I think it may be your guy. Hurry up and come straight to the office." I put on some clothes and ran out of my apartment. At the office, the mood was somber. I nodded to my colleagues, but didn't stop for hellos or small talk. Everyone else was similarly focused, eyes on the television set, watching incoming reporting, or reading reports about the attacks, or standing in small knots of intense conversation. I printed out all the reports of the bombing that had reached our system, along with the 2 claims of responsibility for the attack that had been sent to media outlets, and started analyzing them. Every few minutes, new details kept coming in. About 20 minutes after I had arrived, Tom came to my desk. "So, Ali, what's your guess on who is behind the attacks?" I said, "Based on my reading of these reports and open sources, my guess is al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden." "Why do you think that?" Tom said. Ali Soufan replied, "For a start, that's where his recent fatwas have been pointing. He issued a fatwa on February 23rd, 1998, declaring jihad against the West. And in my opinion, it was a warning that al-Qaeda attack would be launched soon." Tom nodded and said he remembered the fatwa and the memo on it that I had distributed to colleagues. Bin Laden's fatwa had stated, "We, with God's help, call on every Muslim who believes in God and wishes to be rewarded to comply with God's order to kill the Americans and plunder their money wherever and whenever they find it. We also call on Muslim ulema, leaders, youths, and soldiers to launch the raid on Satan's U.S. troops and the devil's supporters allying with them, and to displace those who are behind them so that they may learn a lesson." In addition to bin Laden, the fatwa had been signed by al-Zawahiri, the head of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. His group had not yet merged with al-Qaeda, and he had not yet become bin Laden's deputy, and other prominent Islamic terrorists. Tom asked, "Besides the fatwa, is there anything else indicating that it's likely bin Laden behind the attacks?" I responded, "There is. Take a look at the claims of responsibility for the attacks." I showed Tom what I had printed. The language mirrors past statements by bin Laden. I had underscored some of the lines in the 2 statements and showed them to Tom, along with the similar lines that appeared in past bin Laden declarations, which I had kept from earlier research. "That's a good catch," Tom said. "Let's go to the command center, and you could tell John O'Neill your theory. Headquarters is deciding whether this should be a New York field office case or a Washington field office case." The FBI's Washington, D.C. field office, or WFO, have responsibility for almost all overseas attacks. Al-Qaeda attacks were the exception, and they were normally handled by the New York field office. This was because the office of origin for al-Qaeda was New York. Under the Bureau's OO system, or Office of Origin system, whoever first opens an official case on a particular subject or group — there are 56 FBI offices across the country — subsequently handles all related matters. This ensures that work is not duplicated and that institutional expertise from past investigations is retained and built on rather than having to be relearned by a new office every time another incident occurs. However, because the Washington field office was the first port of call for overseas attacks, and because al-Qaeda had not officially claimed responsibility for the embassy bombings, thus the case had not automatically been given to the New York field office, a Washington field office team was already en route to Nairobi to begin investigating. Before New York office could start investigating, we had to convince headquarters that al-Qaeda was involved. Tom and I walked across the street from our office to the Joint Terrorism Task Force Command Center. It was packed with representatives of every U.S. intelligence and law enforcement outfit with offices in New York City, including the CIA, the U.S. National Security Agency, and the police department. In the center of the room at the podium, manning the secure phones and conversing with headquarters in Washington, were John O'Neill, Pat DeMuro, and other senior FBI agents. Tom told John and Pat, "Ali believes that al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks, and he's got a convincing explanation." I repeated what I had told Tom a few minutes earlier. "Good thinking," John said when I had finished. "I want you to help draft a memo to headquarters in Washington explaining why we think the attack has bin Laden's signature. Come with me." I followed John from the podium to a side room. Sitting at a round table reviewing files was Kevin Cruz from the I-49 squad and an NYPD detective, Tom Corrigan, who was also attached to I-49. Both Kevin and Tom were al-Qaeda experts. John instructed the three of us to prepare a memo for headquarters outlining why we thought al-Qaeda was responsible. I wrote down the analysis I had given John and the others, and Kevin and Tom added historical and other classified information that bolstered the claim. They had been privy to intelligence reports on al-Qaeda cells in the region, specifically Nairobi, and added those details to the memo. When we completed it, we showed it to John, who gave it to his approval and sent it off to headquarters. A reply came back about 30 minutes later. The headquarters had accepted the arguments in our memo. A New York field office team was to be assembled. Half would go to Nairobi and the other half to Dar es Salaam. Senior officials decided that Pat Domora would lead both groups. Arrangements were made for everyone to leave in a few hours. While the decision was being made as to who would wake up the team, John came up to me. Good work on the memo. Thanks, boss, I said. Listen, John continued. I don't want you to go to Nairobi. I need you here with me. We'll have enough agents on the ground there, but I could use your insights here. In Nairobi, the FBI team worked with local law enforcement and intelligence services to begin piecing together the attacks, gathering evidence, performing forensic analysis, questioning eyewitnesses, and following leads. Reward for justice posters were issued by the State Department and distributed worldwide. At the same time, Department of Justice prosecutors from the Southern District of New York flew in and worked with local officials to establish protocol for conducting the investigation. This was essential, as our interest was not just in finding those responsible, but also in ensuring that we would be able to convict them in a U.S. court and use evidence gained for other potential al-Qaeda-related prosecutors. We needed to make certain that all parts of the investigation, from the handling of evidence to the conducting of interviews and interrogations, met federal standards, so that evidence, testimony, and confessions would be admissible in U.S. courts. Counterterrorism is a continuous process. The result of any operation might end up in court, so it is prudent to have the legal process in mind in order to keep all other options open. While my colleagues were doing the hard work on the ground in Nairobi, I worked with John and others in New York, both in providing assistance to the Nairobi team and in tracking the broader al-Qaeda network. One city we started focusing on was London. The British capital had been the location for which al-Qaeda had distributed bin Laden's declaration of jihad and other statements. It was also where media outlets such as CNN and ABC had arranged their meetings with bin Laden. John contacted senior British officials to urge them to take the al-Qaeda threat seriously and to help us investigate alleged al-Qaeda members in London and throughout the United Kingdom. They were at first reluctant to do anything about the presence of Egyptian Islamic Jihad and al-Qaeda operatives in London, who didn't seem to be harming British interests. I did further analysis on the claims of responsibility. The two were almost identical, the only difference being the location and the names of the shadowy platoons or cells that had carried out the bombings. The Nairobi claim announced that the bombing had been planned by the platoon of martyr Khalid al-Said and carried out the operatives from the Arabian Peninsula. The Dar es Salaam claim said that the bombing had been planned by the platoon of Abdullah Azzam and carried out by an Egyptian. The names of the platoons honored Islamist terrorist heroes. Khalid al-Said was one of the terrorists behind the November 1995 attack on a U.S. serviceman in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, an act for which he had been praised by bin Laden. And Abdullah Azzam was an original mentor to many of al-Qaeda's members, widely considered to be the father of the Arab Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Azzam's base had been in Afghanistan, so this pointed to a connection between Afghanistan and the attack. Moreover, the parties in both claims, employing language similar to that used by bin Laden in previous fatwas, referred to themselves as being part of the Islamic Army for the liberation of the holy places. On August 10th, 3 days after the bombing, Debbie Doran, an I-49 agent manning the phones in the FBI's command post in Nairobi, took a call from someone who reported seeing a suspicious Arab man with bandages on his hands and stitches on his forehead. The caller then appeared to have second thoughts and signaled that he was going to hang up. The FBI runs in Debbie's blood. Her father was a special agent in charge in New York. When she signed up for the Bureau, she knew exactly the long hours it would entail, and she was willing to be consumed by important work. Debbie coaxed the caller to stay on the line by assuring him that anything he told her was confidential. It was clear to her from his voice, almost a whisper, with a distinct element of fear, that he worried that saying too much might put him in danger. Debbie spoke of the bombing and reminded him of his moral duty to find the killers of so many innocent people. The caller told her where he had spotted the man and provided the description. An undercover team was dispatched. Among the agents were Stephen Gordon and an NYPD detective named Wayne Parola. Stephen, newly assigned to the SWAT team in the New York field office, had been with the U.S. Army Special Operations Forces. Though at the time he lacked in-depth knowledge of al-Qaeda, he had a remarkable talent for communicating with suspects, a function of his natural empathy and people skills. He would later put this gift to use in key interrogations. The assignment to Nairobi changed Stephen's career path. He was to become a central member of the FBI's al-Qaeda team. Wayne Parola was a member of the Joint Terrorist Task Force and brought a lot of experience. Italian, stocky with a black beard, he walked the walk, talked the talk, and fit the role of an NYPD detective. Wayne, Stephen, and the rest of the team stalked out the location, and a man who matched the description given to Debbie soon appeared. The agents monitored him, waiting for an opportune moment to grab him. When the moment presented itself, they apprehended and subdued him. A search produced $800 bills. The man had no identification or documents, and unsure how serious his injuries were, the team took him to a hospital to be evaluated by a doctor. John Antiseb led the questioning at the hospital, conducted at the detainee's bedside. John had been the case agent for Terror Stop, the 1993 New York City landmarks operation, and he is both an experienced interrogator and schooled in radical terrorism, a fact he soon impressed upon the patient detainee. John asked, "What's your name?" The man replied, "My name is Khalid Salim bin Rashid." Asked where he was from and what he was doing in Nairobi, the man replied that he was from Yemen and that he was looking for business opportunities. John didn't challenge the story. Instead, he asked him how he had been injured. Rashid replied that he had been in the cooperative bank at the time of the bombing and that he had been knocked down by the explosion. He had checked himself into the hospital, where he had gotten stitches where his injuries had been bandaged. John nodded and jotted down everything he said. In the meantime, analyzing his words and studying his moves, he asked Rashid if he was comfortable and whether he had a chance to pray. Rashid said that he had. John went on to ask him a series of seemingly routine questions about his religious beliefs and his views on the United States, the Taliban, and related matters. Rashid settled into his bed and engaged John. He seemed to enjoy the discussion, welcoming the chance to educate John on these subjects. John steered the conversation to Abdul Azam and noticed that Rashid gave him a slight, seemingly involuntary smile upon hearing the name. It was clear that he was knowledgeable about the theology used as a basis for Islamist radicalism, and he, in turn, was impressed with John's knowledge. Rashid had reached a point at which he was completely at ease. John was relaxed, calm, smiling, and polite. He gave the Rashid the impression that he respected him, and Rashid clearly appreciated it. He smiled back and happily chatted. As Rashid was midway through a sentence, John interrupted him and in a swift movement placed a piece of paper and a pen in front of him, telling him sternly, "Write down the number you called after the bombing." Rashid froze, bewildered by the change in John's manner and tone. John repeated, "Write down the number." The certainty with which he gave the command stunned Rashid, who almost robotically wrote down a phone number. He then put down the pen and stared blankly at John. He was shaking. He had no idea how John knew he had called a number. In fact, John didn't know, but his hunch had paid off. And now the FBI team had in custody someone who not only had effectively admitted a role in the bombing, but had supplied an important lead. John asked a follow-up question about the number, but Rashid wouldn't say anything else. As the interrogation was taking place, another team of agents was investigating Rashid's cover story. They went to the hospital where he claimed to have been treated following the bombing, and to the airport to see if they could find his landing card or any other information. At the hospital, after questioning staff and doctors, they discovered that a janitor had found Rashid's belongings stashed on the windowsill above a toilet seat. Among the belongings were truck keys and bullets. They were sent to the FBI forensic team that was analyzing the remains of the truck used for the bombing. The keys were found to match the suicide truck's locks. The agents who had gone to the airport found a landing card under the name Khalid Salim bin Rashid. Following up on the landing card information took them to a villa in Nairobi that appeared to have been used by the bombers. Residue from explosives was found throughout. At the same time, we traced the telephone number Rashid had written down to a man in Yemen named Ahmed al-Hada. By monitoring the number, we found that it appeared to be used as the main contact number for al-Qaeda in Yemen, and that calls placed from it went regularly to a satellite phone that U.S. authorities had already been monitoring because it belonged to Osama bin Laden. There were several calls from bin Laden's satellite phones to the Qaeda Switchboard, and from Qaeda to Nairobi. The al-Qaeda link to the bombing was clear. On the day of the embassy bombings, a Palestinian al-Qaeda operative named Mohammed Sadiq Odeh was arrested at the airport in Karachi. He had flown in from Kenya, and Pakistani authorities had noticed that the picture on his passport was fraudulent. He was questioned for several days before being rendered on August 14th to Kenyan authorities and then transported on the Pakistani Prime Minister's plane to Nairobi. Pat Demora and a team assigned to meet Odeh and his handlers at the Nairobi airport found themselves faced with an unexpected dilemma. The Prime Minister's plane didn't have enough fuel to fly back to Pakistan. Eventually, the fuel tank was filled. A Kenyan official asked pointedly, "But who will pay?" Pat spotted a CI plane on the runway. "Bill it to them," he deadpanned. The next day, August 15th, John Intercept and his team were given access to Odeh. They started off by advising him of his rights, as guided by the Bureau and the Department of Justice, and Odeh signed the form acknowledging that he understood its contents. He went on to admit his involvement in the plot, and he outlined his path to al-Qaeda. He had gone to high school in the Philippines and had become interested in jihad after watching videos and listening to tape recordings and lectures by Abdullah Azzam. In his final year of high school, Odeh needed $1,000, which his father agreed to send him. Upon receiving the money, he asked the cleric whether he should use it to finish his studies or to travel to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideen. The cleric told him to head to Afghanistan. There he attended the Al Fudu training camp near Khost, later joining al-Qaeda. He was trained in assassinations and learned how much explosive power was needed to bring down different types of buildings. Once his training with al-Qaeda was complete, Odeh was sent to Somalia and then Kenya. His first assignment in Kenya was to set up a fishing business whose proceeds was used to help finance the Nairobi cell. His second assignment was to work with explosives. Odeh explained to the interrogators that in late July of 1998, Khalfan Khanis Mohammed, Mustafa Mohammed Fadil, and other al-Qaeda members had gathered in Dar es Salaam to grind TNT to be used in the bombing. The two of them had met Fahad Muhammad Ali Masalam and Ahmed the German in House 213 in the Itala district of the city to make final preparations. With the help of operative Ahmed Khalfan Galani, they had loaded boxes of TNT, cylinder tanks, batteries, detonators, fertilizer, and sandbags into the back of the truck to be used. Odeh explained that on August 1st, 1998, Saleh had told him that all members of al-Qaeda had to leave Kenya within 5 days. That same day, Galani checked into the Hilltop Hotel in Nairobi, and the following day, Odeh and Faroon Hazul met with other al-Qaeda members there. At about the time this meeting was taking place, al-Qaeda members Sheikh Ahmed Salim Sweden and Mustafa Muhammad Fadil followed instructions, left Nairobi on Pakistan International Airlines Flight 744, bound for Karachi via Dubai. And on August 3rd, Fahed Muhammad Ali Masalam purchased tickets for himself and O'Day on Pakistan International Airlines Flight 746, scheduled to depart on August 6th. O'Day joined other Al Qaeda members at the Hilltop Hotel, where they remained in touch with the team in Dar es Salaam. On August 5th, in preparation for meeting bin Laden in Afghanistan following the next day's flight to Karachi, O'Day shaved his beard and got new clothing. While accomplishing his shopping errands, he took a walk along Moai Avenue near the U.S. Embassy. On August 6th, Saleh and Galani left Nairobi for Karachi on Kenyan Airways Flight 310, and O'Day, using a false name, and Masalam departed on Flight 746. Among other details O'Day shared with the interrogators was the role Harun Fazul played in Al-Qaeda, specifically his role in writing reports for the leadership. He wrote in code, if anything fell into the wrong hands, Al-Qaeda's plans would still be safeguarded. O'Day gave the questioners examples. Working meant jihad. Potatoes meant hand grenades. Papers meant bad documents. And goods meant fake documents. John Antisov asked O'Day, can you give an example of how these words would be used? O'Day replied, if we say, how were the goods from Yemen, it would mean we need fake documents from Yemen. O'Day said that Harun's reports were faxed to Pakistan and from there taken by courier to Al-Qaeda's leaders. On August 27th, John Antisov flew with O'Day from Kenya to Stewart Air Force Base, where an FBI team was waiting to collect him and continue questioning him. I was one of the members of that team. I stepped onto the plane and gave John a hug. Welcome home, I said. Great work. This was an understatement. John and the team in Kenya had done a tremendous job. O'Day, wearing a dark jumpsuit, was taken by a SWAT team onto a helicopter and flown to a jail in New York. On August 20th, 13 days after the bombings, I was in the middle of a conversation with John O'Neill about Al-Qaeda operations in London when we heard a run of expletives and shouts from people gathered in front of a television screen nearby. We ran over and watched a reporter announce that President Clinton had ordered the firing of missiles from Navy vessels in the Arabian Sea to bomb sites in Sudan and Afghanistan believed to be run by or connected to bin Laden. The sites included a pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum and Al-Qaeda training camps near coast. David Cohn and Charlie from the CIA had called John only minutes before to warn him that the bombing was about to take place. This, the reporter said, was the U.S. retaliation for the embassy bombings. Crowds in Sudan and elsewhere in the Arab and Muslim world were protesting the strikes. The United States was seen as having attacked without cause or warning, killing innocent people. What are they doing? Shouted one colleague in disbelief. Don't they realize we got agents on the ground in hostile territories? Why the hell didn't they at least tell us first that they were going to do this? I asked John. He shrugged as I followed him to a side office off the command post and called Pat Demuro to check on the security of the agents on the ground in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, all now easy targets for anyone wishing to avenge the U.S. strikes. If the FBI had known about the bombings in advance, our agents would have been pulled out or taken off the streets until the issue died down. Headquarters instructed all personnel on the ground in East Africa to keep a low profile until the furor over the attacks had subsided. Being in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam was already dangerous enough. Al-Qaeda had just attacked there and likely still had the means to attack again. There were many phone calls home that day from the two African cities, FBI agents assuring their loved ones back home that they were safe. There was some talk that President Clinton had ordered the strikes to distract attention from his ongoing Monica Lewinsky scandal, but I didn't believe, nor did I want to believe it, that national security would be used in such a manner. Still, whoever had decided to keep the FBI out of the loop took a great risk with American lives. The emir of one of the camps bombed was Hassan al-Kamidi. The bombing had a devastating effect on him, deepening his hatred of the United States and prompting him to ask bin Laden if he could martyr himself in an upcoming al-Qaeda operation. Rashid was brought back in for further interrogation, this time by Stephen Gowden and Wayne Parola. Neither of them spoke Arabic, so a translator was furnished by the Washington field office. He was an older man and Rashid saw him as a father figure. The two bonded. Stephen and Wayne by asking Rashid the questions John Antisev had asked at the start of the original interrogation. What was he doing in Nairobi? What was his connection to the bombing? Rashid initially gave the same answers he had supplied previously. Stephen and Wayne confronted him with the evidence. In addition, Stephen gave him meals ready to eat, or MREs, instant rations for U.S. soldiers abroad. Rashid was fascinated with the idea of an instant meal, found the MREs to be tasty, and especially loved the cookies that came with them. Gradually, his stonewalling gave to a kind of resignation. Seemingly overwhelmed by the weight of the new evidence, he simply declared, "Here's what I want. I want to be tried in America, not Kenya, because America is my enemy. If you promise me this, I'll tell you everything." The FBI discussed his request with the Department of Justice, and it was agreed that there was no reason not to accede to it. We would have wanted to try him in the United States anyway, as he attacked U.S. embassies and murdered U.S. civilians. Assistant U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald drew up a document stating that the United States would endeavor to get him extradited to the United States for a trial. Rashid was presented with the document and an Arabic translation. He seemed happy with it. After it was signed, he said, "Thank you. And now I have something to tell you." He paused and then continued. "My name is not Khalid Salim al-Bin Rashid. I am Muhammad al-Ohali, and I am from Saudi Arabia." Having fulfilled his role as a suicide bomber without, in fact, dying, a feat he would eventually explain, as al-Ohali had fled the scene of an attack and was alive to tell the FBI his story. He said that his path to al-Qaeda had been through the Chaldean training camp. While the camp was not controlled by al-Qaeda, it was in the habit of letting the leadership know about promising recruits. Al-Ohali had been one such recruit. He told the interrogators with pride that his skills had been distinguished from his fellow recruits and that he had been recommended to al-Qaeda. In due course, he had met bin Laden. Al-Hali told the interrogators that he had found himself agreeing with everything that bin Laden said. He then pledged bayat, loyalty to bin Laden, and joined al-Qaeda. Soon after, he asked bin Laden for a mission. Bin Laden told him that something would come his way. Eventually, bin Laden summoned al-Hali and told him that he would be part of an effort to inflict a mighty blow against the United States. He would help bomb the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi. On July 31st, he had flown from Pakistan to Afghanistan to Dubai, where he had missed his intended flight to Nairobi, not arriving until August 2nd. Al-Ohali took the interrogating team through everything he knew about the bombing, from the bomb maker, whom he identified as the Egyptian known as Saleh, through to his actions on the day of the attack. He was not a proficient liar, and when he tried to withhold information or to protect the identity of his friends, the interrogation team called him out on it. Around May 1998, Harun Fazul, who was to serve as a guide for al-Hali and his fellow designated bomber, Jihad Ali, during their time in Nairobi, rented a villa at 43 New Rwanda Estates. On August 4th, Ohali, Harun, and other al-Qaeda members reconnoitered at the U.S. Embassy. On the 5th, 6th, and 7th, Ohali called Ahmed al-Qaeda Switchboard in Yemen from a phone at the villa. On the morning of the bombing at around 9:30 a.m., Harun accompanied the bombers from the villa to the embassy. They traveled in a convoy led by Harun in his own truck, with Ohali and Jihad Ali following in the bomb-laden truck. Ohali had equipped with 4 stun grenades, a 9mm Beretta handgun, bullets, and keys to the padlocks on the bomb truck. At around 10:30, Harun threw a stun grenade at embassy guards to engage and distract them, while Ohali and Jihad Ali continued on toward the building. Harun drove off, his part in the mission finished. As Ohali and Jihad Ali got closer to the embassy, they reached a point where the gates and another set of guards prevented them from going any further. Ohali jumped out. It had been agreed that his role would be to detonate himself at these very gates in order to enable Jihad Ali to explode himself and the car close enough to the embassy to do damage. Brandishing the stun grenades, O'Holly shouted at the guard to open the gates. The guard refused, and O'Holly threw a grenade at him. Seeing the commotion and the explosion, Jihad Ali began firing a pistol at the embassy, causing people to scatter. O'Holly was unsure what to do next. His mission had been to help Jihad Ali get as close to the embassy as possible. Although the gates were still closed, the guards had dispersed, and Jihad Ali was in fact now close enough to fulfill his mission. For O'Holly to blow himself up would be considered suicide rather than martyrdom, forbidden under Islam. It was a fine distinction, but one of importance to O'Holly. After making a quick calculation, O'Holly began to run away and was knocked over and injured by the explosion when Jihad Ali blew himself up. O'Holly entered a nearby hospital, disposing of his remaining bullets from his gun in the bathroom in which they were later found, and placing a few other belongings on the windowsill ledge. He told the nurses and doctors who treated him that he had been a victim of the blast. After being stitched up and bandaged, he left the hospital and contacted al-Qaeda through the al-Qaeda Switchboard, reporting what had happened. He asked that someone send him a passport and money. $1,000 was transferred, which O'Holly used to buy new clothes. He was planning his escape from Nairobi when he was picked up. O'Holly was flown to the United States, and once jailed, was asked who his next of kin was. He pointed to Stephen Gordon. O'Holly was tried in 2001 and sentenced in federal court to life without parole, along with Wadi al-Hajj and two other operatives involved in the bombings, Muhammad Ode and Khalfan Khanis Muhammad. Ali Muhammad was arrested in September 1998 when he tried to flee Egypt after being subpoenaed for his connection to the bombings. He pled guilty in May 1999, but was never sentenced. To date, he is awaiting sentencing and is being held in a secure location. Pat Fitzgerald had long been pressing for Muhammad to be tried and convicted, and when I went with Pat to debrief him in jail, the former double agent seemed shaken. The investigators followed up on O'Holly's leads, all of which proved accurate. We later learned that in the days after the Nairobi bombing, Harun Fazul hired people to clean the villa at 43 New Rwanda Estates, and around August 14th, he left Nairobi for the Comoros Islands. In Dar es Salaam, Khalfan Khanis Muhammad cleaned the premises at House 213 in Ilia and made arrangements for the cleaning and discarding of the grinder used to prepare for the TNT. On August 8th, he left Dar es Salaam for Cape Town. A full picture emerged of how the attacks had been planned and carried out, and the prosecution teams began planning the indictments and trials of bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders for their roles. The searches of the different facilities, safe houses, and offices used by al-Qaeda generated valuable documents, phone numbers, and photographs of many al-Qaeda members. At the Help Africa offices, agents recovered passport-sized photos used to issue bogus identification cards. The photos were of the entire al-Qaeda leadership, in addition to most of the main operatives from the period bin Laden was based in Sudan. The pictures became the basis for one of our first al-Qaeda photo books, a term the agency uses for mugshots and other pictures of suspects related to an investigation. At the same time, our investigative interest now had taken new directions. First, there was Yemen. It was clear that al-Qaeda members were based there and using the country for operations. The fake passports used by O'Holly and other terrorists involved in the attacks were issued in Yemen, with Ahmed al-Hada's phone number the main means of communication. Then there were leads pointing to al-Qaeda in London. We had started investigating London in 1996 because bin Laden's media office was based there. After the East African embassy bombings, British authorities had finally arrested Khalid al-Fawaz and two of al-Zawahiri's operatives. Working with Scotland Yard, we found that the claims of responsibility for the attacks had been faxed by al-Zawahiri's two Egyptians, Abdul Abdelbari and Ibrahim Idris, from the Grapevine, a copy shop across the street from a residence on Beethoven Street used by the group's media operatives. We dubbed it the Beethoven Office. In the second half of 1999, bin Laden met with some 30 graduates of a special close combat training session at Lokar Training Camp. assembled by Khalid, also known as Tawfiq bin Attash. The members of the group were viewed as a special operations unit. Khalid brought in a Pakistani trainer to teach the operations hand-to-hand combat in Taekwondo and other martial arts. After the session was finished, the students were sent to Kandahar to see bin Laden. He congratulated them on graduating and lectured them about the East Africa embassy bombings, divulging operational details, including the vehicles and explosives used, and explaining, in particular, the reasons for the Nairobi attack. One, Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, which he claimed had resulted in the death of 30,000 Muslims, had been directed from the Nairobi operation. Two, the embassy was the base of support for Sudanese rebel leaders and politician John Garang de Mabur. And three, it was the biggest center of American intelligence in East Africa. Among the group to whom bin Laden offered this justification were Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, two of the 9/11 hijackers.